The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Module 3. I apologise first of all for having to change the time for this, but it was unavoidable. But thank you for tuning in. Just want to make sure that I'm being heard, the normal process. So just on the right-hand side under the question box, could I just ask you to type in the word clear? That will let me know that I'm coming across loud and clear, which would be great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, John. Thanks, Marcia. Excellent. Sounds like I am coming across loud and clear, which is great. Now, the normal process, of course, is that you'll receive the slides and, of course, the recording at the end of this presentation. So no problems about that whatsoever. So let's launch in. We've got a lot to cover in a very short amount of time. And as normal process, if you've got any questions, any comments, any observations, type them in the question box there, just where you wrote the word clear, and that way we can deal with them as they come up. All right, so where have we come from? Well, we looked at the ingredients of feedback in Unit 1, and I hope you're still continuing to give positive feedback or negative feedback for that matter, but constructive feedback nevertheless. You'll remember in Unit 2 we looked at influencing capabilities and we got you to complete the profile, and I hope you're using and exercising a flexibility around the way you like to persuade people. And of course today we're going to look at optimising team performance. Okay, so I won't go into Units 4, 5 and 6 at this stage, but I'll certainly be briefing you on that towards the end of today or today's session. Now, I would challenge you to say that I believe that your primary responsibility or your primary role, if you like, as a leader is to get the very best out of the people that you lead. Now, some of you might say, well, surely it's about getting the product out the door or getting the service at top-notch standard. All those things, of course, are important. But at the end of the day, when I talk about the term leadership, it's about getting the best out of everybody that you lead. Now, it may not be possible to get everyone at 100% performance. In fact, it probably isn't. And I think that's a fairly liberating and realistic point of view to take. So, for example, if one of your team members is, let's say you could measure it at 5 out of 10, maybe getting them to a 10 out of 10 may not be possible, but you can certainly get them to a 6 out of 10. And if you can increase everybody's performance, if you like, by 10% by creating the right environment, then you're going to get a significant growth in your team. So that's the way I want you to think about this topic. It's not so much about getting 100% from everyone, but it might just be about getting an extra 10% from each person. And ultimately and exponentially, what happens is that increases the performance across the team. So what I want to do is really focus in on conversations in this session. I believe that conversations hold the key to good leadership. In other words, we often don't have enough conversations in the workplace. And I'm not talking about chit-chat. At the other end of the scale, I'm not talking about necessarily performance management conversations. I'm just talking about people-related conversations. There's two types of conversations in the workplace. There are task-related and people-related. I want to refer today with the people-related conversations, and I want to give you a couple of frameworks that will help you with this and give you a chance to start having more dialogue and more meaningful dialogue with each of the people that are in your team. By doing that, you've got a very good chance of increasing performance in your team, and I'll show you how that's the case as we go through the process today. All right, first of all, what I want to do is give you some sobering statistics. And these statistics very much underline or underpin the need for us to have more conversations. Let's have a look. 79% of organisations worldwide struggle to engage and retain their employees. That's a lot, 79%, according to Deloitte's. So engagement worldwide is problematic. In fact, I've seen some surveys that suggest that only 20% of people would consider themselves to be engaged in the workplace. 86% of organisations believe they don't have an adequate leadership pipeline to address these problems. So obviously, if we don't have a strong leadership literacy, it's very difficult to be able to resolve those sorts of problems. 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking involvement from their team. And worse still, 89% of leaders fail to listen or respond to the interpersonal cues from those they interact with. All right, so these are pretty sobering figures. Disturbingly, only 5% of leaders are effective in building trust in their interactions with team members. 60% of employees felt their self-esteem was dented by their leader at work. These people would rather do almost anything else than sit through a performance conversation with their boss, although they did acknowledge that a good boss with excellent interaction skills could enhance their productivity by as much as 60%. 79% of employees who quit their job cite a lack of appreciation as the key reason for leaving. So you can see there's pretty damning statistics. 65% of North Americans report that they didn't receive any recognition in the previous year. Now, they may well have received recognition, but they didn't perceive themselves to be receiving recognition. So all of these figures would suggest that we're not engaging and connecting with the people that we lead in our teams. And hence, that's my reason for talking about the need to have more meaningful conversations. And what I'm hoping to do in this session is give you some frameworks that will help you with that very issue. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about the conversation and about conversations in general in the workplace, and get you to consider some of these issues. Firstly, in one of my books, Conversations at Work, which I co-authored with Aubrey Warren, we say in our book that organisations are conversations. If you actually think about it, putting aside the, what you do, putting aside the resources that you have and the equipment that you use, at the end of the day, any organisation is a bunch of people working towards a common cause. In other words, an organisation can be perceived as a series of conversations. Some of these conversations are long, some of them are short, some of them are done in the lunchroom, some of them are done in the boardrooms, some of them are done in the bathroom. Some of them are structured, some of them unstructured, some of them are prepared, some are impromptu. Some of them occur in the hallway. So if you think about it, you can conceptualize organizations as a bunch of conversations. So the question then is really, good quality conversation, is good quality conversation sadly lacking? Are we now moving away from the connection that we have with people around the old-fashioned conversation? Are we using email too much when we should, in fact, be having one-on-one conversation? I think the answer to that is yes. And I think the issue is that many of us try to have conversations via email when, in fact, email is asynchronous, meaning, of course, that when you send an email, the person will respond to it when they're ready to respond to it. So it's not the ideal medium to be having conversations. A lot of people talk about the art of conversation, that there's some sort of an art form to it. I don't believe there is any art form to conversations. I think we're used to having conversations. We have thousands, if not tens and millions of conversations regularly with all sorts of people in all sorts of situations about all sorts of things. So I'm not sure that it's really an art form. I think it's true to say that some conversations do require some skill. But at the end of the day, most of us are pretty used to having conversations with people. So I'm not convinced it's an art form. And in fact, it's quite interesting that if we consider that, if your parents, for example, were alive today, imagine if you rang them up this evening and you told them that you were having training to have conversations. I think they'd find that quite humorous. And that's how far we've removed ourselves in the last 15 years from conversations. So it does beg the question, doesn't it? Have we actually lost the need for conversations? And, are we using email? Are we using technology? Are we using text when we really should be having good old face-to-face or even telephone conversations, or conversations via technology, where telecommuting? So it's interesting, if you came to work this morning, for example, on public transport, say a bus or a train, what I'd like you to do is this evening is just stick your head up from the screen that you're looking at and have a look around on the bus or the train. You'll be amazed at how many people have got their head glued in a screen of type. And then when they get home, of course, they've got themselves glued to another screen, all the while making Facebook updates and so forth on another screen. So our whole life now is revolving around screens. So we had a manager say the other day, to me at least, that he said to me, I don't have time for conversations. I love what you're talking about, Tim, but really I don't have time for conversations. And I was a little bit stunned by that sort of comment because, I said to him, you mean you don't have any conversations? He said, oh, no, we have work-related conversations, but we just don't have time to be having the sort of conversations you're referring to. And of course, what he was doing, he was also asking me to sort out his turnover problem, which was around 25% of his team was disappearing every year. And obviously there was a correlation between that and the fact that he wasn't having conversations with his team members. Two of my colleagues in the United States, James Kuzner and Barry Posner, in a very, very good book called Credibility, highly recommend you get that as a read, by the way, suggest that leadership is a relationship, which I think is a wonderful phrase. And then my question to them is, my rhetorical question to them is, how does one have a relationship? And of course, there's only one answer, isn't there? And that is one conversation at a time. It's impossible to have a conversation or a relationship, I should say, with anybody unless you have a series of conversations. So we can't avoid it. And of course, leadership is around a professional working relationship. And that's essentially what leadership really is. So we can't afford not to have these conversations. Now, there are a whole lot of barriers that prevent us from having conversations in the workplace, and I want to run through 9 of them with you, and I'm sure you'll recognize them. And I'd like you to have a think about how many of these barriers actually impact on your capacity to build your team by having regular, meaningful dialogue with each of your team members. The first barrier, and these aren't necessarily in order, is the barrier of inattention during a conversation. How many of us try to do 2 or 3 things at once in the workplace under the guise of multitasking? In fact, the latest research shows clearly that we can't actually multitask. We aren't actually effective at multitasking. So, for example, if somebody comes into your office area, if you've got an office, and they knock on the door and you're tapping out an email, the truth of the matter is, often what we do is we keep tapping out the email, and at the same time we say to the person, keep going, I'm listening to you, I've just got to get this email out the door. Well, of course, what happens is that the email probably doesn't have the due respect that it deserves, and secondly, the person at the door probably thinks that your email is at least, if not more important than what you've got to say. So you've got this situation where you're not actually doing much good to either of those activities. And of course, the key thing to do there is to stop tapping out on the email and give the person 100% attention, or if the email really is critical, to say to the person, just wait for a moment, give me 10 minutes, I need to finish this. As soon as I've finished, I'll come over and we can have a discussion. All right, so those sorts of things Warren Bennis, the great management consultant, said the biggest challenge we're facing in the 21st century is the management of attention, which I think is a wonderful concept. We are bombarded from left, right, and centre with information coming from all sorts of different places. And what happens is that the challenge for us is to be able to maintain our focus and concentration because things are happening all around us. So clearly that's one of the big barriers to having conversations. Another barrier to having conversations, I think, is the whole notion of restricted information channels. We often hear in the workplace, you'll get told on a need-to-know basis. I'm sure you've heard that saying. And I wonder whether you use that yourself. Or no news is good news. So we hear all of this information in the workplace, but it's based on a very disturbing assumption. And the assumption is this, that people who are in team members, I should say, can't be trusted with information, but yet management can. So what we do is we filter the information through to our team, and we only tell them the information that we think is very, very select. It's very, we don't give them the whole picture, in other words. And if we don't give people the whole picture, what happens, of course, is that they don't have the whole picture. So how can they possibly have the same perspective as you as the team leader? They can't. They need the whole picture. So we need to be opening up information channels, not closing them down. And I'm sure you're aware of that. Another barrier that we've got in our workplace is the lack of feedback. And that's why our whole first topic in the Lunch and Learn series was really around the need to have feedback. And feedback, in fact, is really important. I think we've sort of covered that enough in Unit 1. But if you're not giving enough feedback, then you're obviously creating a barrier for conversation, because a lot of conversation is, in fact, about feedback or around feedback. So that becomes critically important. Another barrier is a culture of not asking questions. Now, probably you and certainly me and many, many others, we've all been, educated, if you like, into answering questions. If you've done a trade or you've done a university degree or two, you have been taught to answer questions. That's the whole purpose of gaining knowledge. So by the time you move into a leadership role, you're not used to actually asking questions because you're too busy answering questions. So therefore, we need to be asking more open-ended questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. All of these questions are critically important, because what they do is they provide an opportunity to develop a dialogue and to actually start a conversation with the people that we are working with. All right, so that becomes critically important. Now, another barrier to having regular conversations is one that's fairly subtle, but it's about too much formality. Often what happens is leaders will have these conversations in their office, which is the worst place to have them because it's your territory. And of course, you might feel very comfortable in your office because it's your territory, but what about the other person? They may not feel so comfortable. So my suggestion is to get out of the office, in fact, even possible, get out of the building and go and have conversations in a neutral place, such as a coffee shop. You'll get more done and you'll find that people are more relaxed in those sorts of environments. So the whole notion of formality does impact on people's ability to have conversations. An over-reliance on email, and I've alluded to this at the beginning of the program. Now, if you think about it, well, I don't think you need to think about it. You know this. The average person spends 2.5 hours a day on email. So you might like to think about how long you spend on email. Now, I think email's a wonderful thing. It's one of the great tools. I don't know how we actually do without it. But the reality is a lot of us are using email to have conversations when in fact all we should do is pick up the phone or get out of our workstation and go and talk to the person directly if they happen to be close by, because that's how we can we can have meaningful dialogue. So I think in many respects, email is actually preventing us from having regular, meaningful conversations with each other. So email is a big barrier, communication barrier to having regular conversations. Barrier number 7. Barrier number 7 is a lack of role models. Now, if you don't have good role models, then that is the people that lead you, then and they don't have regular conversations and meaningful dialogue with each other, then it's likely that that's going to filter all the way through the whole organisation. So the place to start is at the leadership team. And if leaders are seen to be having transparent, open, robust conversations with each other, then people start modelling that behaviour and believe that it's appropriate that they do the same thing. So that's a barrier, obviously, to good communication. Another barrier is the fear of emotion. What we actually do is we decide not to have conversations with people because we're worried about opening up a can of worms. So we think that by having conversations with people, we might open this can of worms. So we work on the basis of let sleeping dogs lie. So we don't have these conversations with people because we're worried about the emotional output that comes out of these conversations. But the reality is all it is an elephant in the room, and it doesn't get communicated, and we don't talk about it. But the feelings are still there, and people are still upset about it, and as a result of that, it's problematic. So we need to be having conversations about a variety of topics in the workplace, and that becomes extremely important. And barrier number 9, I find it interesting that the physical office layout of the last 25 to 30 years has moved towards open office. The open office environment was put together because it was believed that by having an open office, we could then encourage people to be having more conversations. Because there were less offices, people could simply move over and talk to someone about what they need to do in the workplace. But the flip side's true about this, isn't it? That we have less conversations because we're worried that we're going to be overheard by 6 or 7 people in the open office space. So what we do is we don't have those conversations, and that's problematic. So there may not be much you can do about this, because by the time you've booked a room to have the conversation with someone, the opportunity is lost. So you can see there's many other barriers as well, but there are 9 barriers that I think are critically important to having conversations. So you might like to have a think about how they impact on you, and I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments or observations that people may have in relation to any of those barriers. All right, just while we're waiting for that, let's move on. Now, what I want to share with you now is a framework that's I'm very proud to say is being implemented all over the world in all sorts of cultures, right across the board, and it's called the 5 Conversations Framework. Now, the 5 Conversations Framework I put together originally because I wasn't a strong believer in the performance review. I'm still not a strong believer in the performance review, and what I was hoping is that the 5 Conversations Framework would replace the performance review, and in many cases it has, I'm proud to say. But in other places, people are using this as an enabler, and by having the 5 conversations, they're able to create a situation where it's an enabler for a far better performance review, because many of these things are being discussed on a regular basis. So in a nutshell, what the 5 Conversations Framework's all about is 5 short conversations once a month with each of your team members. Now, when I say short, I'm talking 10-15 minutes. I am not talking 2 hours. And if the conversations go for 2 hours, then clearly you've decided to talk for 2 hours, and that's your decision. But really, the framework is designed to have short, sharp, meaningful, people-related conversations every month over a 5-month period. What do you do after 5 months? You repeat the process. So in other words, over the course of a year, it's quite possible to be having 10-minute conversations about people-related issues over the course of a year. And really, if you think about it, that's not too much of an ask. It's not difficult to do. So what are these conversations about? Well, you can see on your screen there, in month 1, we have a climate review conversation. Now, a climate review conversation is very much around the notion of job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So the very first question in the framework is, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your current job satisfaction? And the person might say 6. And then, of course, the next question is why? And then, of course, the conversation takes off from there. So if you're interested, send me an email and I'm happy to send you a full list of all the different questions that relate to the conversations that I'm just outlining to you now. In month 2, we have a conversation around strengths and talents. Now, why strengths and talents? Well, this is based on the positive psychology movement of the last 25 years that posits that we should actually be talking about what people's innate talents and strengths are and how they can be better utilised in the workplace. So instead of going straight for the jugular and talking about negative aspects of what people do, we start by having a conversation about what people's strengths are. Now, there's a high correlation between what people enjoy at work and what they're good at. The research shows that. So the way that conversation starts is very simply, what aspect of your work do you enjoy? Now, hopefully they'll say something, but once you start talking to people about what they enjoy doing, you'll probably notice that they're reasonably good at it. Now, the question then moves to a situation about how you might be able to utilize their innate talents and strengths in their current or future roles in the team. And of course, we're starting off on a very positive foot. This creates what we call an upward spiral of positivity rather than a downward spiral of negativity. And it becomes really powerful in that sense. So that's the strengths and talents conversation. Now, they're reasonably easy conversations to have, because then we move into perhaps the more difficult conversation, which is opportunities for growth. And what this conversation is about is where the team member can actually lift their game, where they can actually improve. And again, we ask them to come to that conversation having given that some careful thought. So it's not about you evaluating them, it's about them coming to the team meeting or your meeting with them, having thought carefully about where they could perhaps improve their own performance. Now, then we move on, and as you can imagine, in conversation 2 and conversation 3, there's likely to be some learning needs that have come out of those conversations. In other words, it's quite possible that, how can we build on your strengths, and how can we minimize or build on your weaknesses as well? So that in conversation 4, it's around support and growth, the learning and development conversation. So we're going to talk to people about what you can do to assist them to improve their skill sets in those areas. Now, again, it's not about sending people off to training courses necessarily. It might be about coaching them and guiding them and giving them some skills and so forth in how you might assist them to be more effective at what they do. So this conversation 4, is really a culmination of conversations 2 and 3. So you can capitalize on that. In the human resources area, they call this a training needs analysis. So what you're doing is you're creating a training needs analysis by asking people what we can do to support your growth and development. Now, conversation 5 is really, whereas conversation 4 is about the individual, conversation 5 is around the organisation or the workplace. So conversation 5 is really around how we can make the workplace more efficient and effective. So what can we do in the team context that can improve efficiency and effectiveness in the team? That's essentially what conversation 5 is about. So what are some ways and means of improving efficiency and effectiveness? Again, we're expecting your team members to come to you in that conversation, having thought carefully about some ways and means of improving the workplace where the team actually works. So again, if you prepare your team members for that, you should come up with some reasonable suggestions. Not everything that comes up in these conversations, of course, will be useful, but quite a few of them will. And of course, if you're able to implement them easily and effortlessly, then that builds morale as well in your team. So you can see that the 5 Conversations framework is very much around building capability both in the team and in the workplace. So I would definitely commend that as a framework for you to help you improve your ability to have regular, meaningful conversations with your team members. As I said to you, we're talking 10 minutes once a month with each team member. So, and I'm alluding to this, but later on when we finish up, I'm going to suggest to you that one of your homework items will be to start having regular dialogue with each of your team members, to be having a regular people-related conversation once a month with each team member. And this framework, of course, can help you do that. So the framework will give you some guidelines and some topics to be able to cover, and questions if you want them, to be able to have those regular conversations with each team member once a month. And then, of course, you just repeat the cycle as you go. So that's the 5 Conversations framework. And if you're interested in that framework in a deeper sense, you'll notice that there's a reference at the bottom there. So you can get more information from my book, which originally was about the 5 Conversations framework. My latest book also talks about the 5 Conversations framework. Okay. Now, there are 5 more conversations I suggest that you might like to consider. Now, these conversations can happen anywhere. They can happen in the corridor. They can happen, you can actually organise these conversations, whatever you choose. And in fact, I'd have to say to you this, that in terms of developing your team, one of the most powerful and often underestimated conversations is what I would term the corridor conversation. This is a conversation that happens on the spur of the moment, away from the workplace, where people use the opportunity to converse. So don't underestimate the tremendous potential in those impromptu conversations. They're not necessarily interruptions that are negative. They can actually be quite positive. And if one of your team members comes up to you and wants to talk about something in the corridor, it can possibly wait, and you may use it on a regular basis where you can say to the person, well, look, can this wait till our normal regular catch up, or do we need to talk about it now? So, but often you might find that they're quite useful to have those conversations in the corridor. Okay, so what are these 5 additional conversations? Well, one of them is the coaching conversation. Now, coaching is a conversation. It's not where you sit there and direct people on how to do something. That's the old-fashioned notion of coaching. But a coaching conversation is where you converse with the other person on a project and how they might go ahead and do the project. So you're actually extracting ideas and thoughts and opportunities from them on how they might go about doing an item of work or a task that you've delegated to them. So the coaching conversation is very effective. And I think sometimes we try to cut that short because we're very busy, but it's an invaluable conversation and should be perceived as a conversation. The second type of conversation is the mentoring conversation. Now, depending on your age and experience, you may find that people see you as a mentor in your workplace. If I were you, I would definitely embrace that. And if you've had a good mentor in your life, you'll know how incredibly powerful it can be. So, and I still to this day spend a lot of time mentoring, and I enjoy it greatly. In fact, I would suggest to you I get more out of it perhaps even than the person that I'm mentoring. So mentoring, the difference, you might say, what's the difference between coaching and mentoring? Well, coaching is probably very much a task-related type of activity, whereas mentoring is a broader concept around career development and looking at things and challenging people in terms of their own growth and development as an employee. So mentoring can be very powerful. Now, the other thing, of course, as a leader, if you don't have a good mentor, then seek one out. It can be highly effective and give you a new and fresh look at the way you do things. So that can be very, very effective. Now, another type of conversation is the delegation conversation. Now, a lot of people think delegation isn't really a conversation because it's about barking out a few orders or whatever. Not so. Of course, if it's a reasonably complex task, it can become a conversation where you're asking the person to bounce ideas off you so that you're getting some input and feedback about how some task can be done more effectively or efficiently. So delegation, which is something that many of us struggle with because we all think we can do it better, and it does take time, and therefore by the time we've done it, it's just faster and quicker. Trouble is, of course, we're creating a rod for our own back, aren't we? Because by doing the task instead of delegating it, then we're not skilling up our task to be able to do the task, and so that we can hand it off to somebody else. So get used to delegating and see it as a conversation rather than sort of some directive or set of instructions for the person. Now, the last two I think are very, very valuable, and I think they're often lost in terms of leading. The fourth conversation that I'd strongly recommend that you consider having with your team members is what we call the visioning conversation. So what Simon Sinek calls the why of work. You should be explaining to people why you want something done the way you do. So in other words, people don't often have a big picture in your team about the consequences of not doing something correctly or the great rewards that would come from doing it effectively. Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say that you're working in a production area, and at the end of a shift, when everyone's tired, you walk up to somebody in your team and you ask them if they would sweep the production area before they leave to go home that night after their shift. Now, it's late at night, people are tired. It's not likely that person's going to be seeing that as a wonderfully challenging developmental opportunity. But nevertheless, you can do that in two ways. You can give them a set of instructions and say, I'd like you to sweep the floor, please, before you go home on your shift. Or you could say to them something along the lines of, I wouldn't normally ask you to do this, but I'm asking you to do this because tomorrow we've got a potential customer who's coming in to look over the production area. And we want to create a really good impression because they're thinking very seriously of moving all of their ordering over to us. And so by having a clean production area, we're going to be able to set a really good tone, which could potentially mean that a serious amount of business and job opportunities for our production area. So would you mind doing that? So you see, they're probably still not going to be terribly excited about it because it's the end of a shift. But the point is, at least they know why they're doing what they're doing. So we've got a situation now where the person's got some context. They're well aware of why they're actually being asked to do something, and that becomes extremely relevant to their situation. Now, there's two reasons why leaders do not explain the why to their team members. The first and obvious reason is because they believe that the team member already understands what it is and why they need to do it. That's a big mistake for you as a team leader. Remember, your team have got a narrower vision than you have. You've got a bigger vision than they have. They really can only see what's in front of them. So what you need to do is to give them some expansion and let them understand the context. There's two ways of doing this. You can talk about the benefits of what it is, not so much just for them as well as for the organisation, or you can talk about the pitfalls of not doing it right. In other words, what are the things that are going to occur that are likely to be problematic as a result of not completing this report or not doing or not getting this order in on time. So you can do that in two ways. Now, the other reason that people or leaders don't have visioning conversations is that it takes time. And because it takes so much time, people think, well, why don't I just tell people what to do and they can work it out for themselves? Well, people need to understand what their work entails and the context and why it's important. Most people, interestingly enough, in a team, consider their work to be pretty much irrelevant. You know, they don't see their work as very important. Surveys show this clearly. So it's important for you to let people understand the context and the value of the work that they do for you and for the team. And the way to do that, of course, is to give them some sense of vision as to why you want the job done in a particular way. All right, now the last of the 5 conversations, the 5 more developmental conversations, is the encouraging conversation. Now, I find it amazing that leaders don't encourage team members anywhere near as much as they ought to. You saw some statistics earlier that showed that employees certainly didn't feel that managers were terribly encouraging. And in fact, many people left because of that, ultimately, once they had an exit interview and it was obvious why they were leaving, the real reason, in other words. So please encourage. And by encouraging, the simplest way to encourage anybody is to simply use one word. Thanks. Thanks for completing that report. Thanks for dealing with that customer under difficult circumstances. Thanks for staying back an hour after work today. Thanks for speaking up in the team meeting when we needed you to do that. Thanks for resolving that problem without making a fuss. There are plenty of opportunities in the workplace to say thank you, and I really believe that people have lost sight of this. I think as a team leader, saying thank you is really, really important. People want to feel appreciated. It's not the only way, of course, you can encourage people, but it's a good start nevertheless. So just thank people for the work that they do. Because most people, of course, as we know, don't come to work wanting to mess up. They come to work wanting to do a decent job. And a lot of occasions they do. It's just that we don't acknowledge that. Now, the other way to encourage people is just to let them know that you believe in them. You and me and everybody else in the world is insecure. We all doubt ourselves. Even the person that you believe to be the most confident person that you've possibly imagined has doubts. Everyone has doubts. Your CEO has doubts. You know, the janitor has doubts. Your team members all have doubts. You have doubts. We all have doubts. So because we're all doubtful, then part of being a leader is actually to encourage people. Let people know by saying to them words such as, I'm very confident that you'll come up with the right approach. Or I'm backing you on this because I believe that you can do this. All right, now they're simple words, but used sincerely, authentically, in the right place at the right time, for the right task, can make a huge difference in terms of people's belief. And their energy level goes up, and people often will perform to meet your expectations. In fact, psychologists tell us this, that people will often perform to your expectations of them. So if you have an expectation that you believe that people will get the job done, then guess what? They'll get the job done, and they'll get the job done because they don't want to disappoint you. This is, of course, assuming you've got good respect with all of your team members, which, of course, is another topic. So, folks, there's the 5 additional conversations. So I've shared with you 10 conversations. And these conversations can be impromptu or they can be organised. But I really want you to sit down with each team member once a month, if you're not already doing it, and sit down and have a decent people-related conversation every month. just for 10 minutes, you would be surprised at the impact it'll have. And it'll have an enormous impact, and one that and people often say, well, I don't have time for that. Well, you don't have time. You can't afford not to find the time for it if you're really interested in building up people's capabilities, if you're really interested in engaging your people, and if you're really interested in them doing the very best work that they can. So I strongly recommend you do that. Now, two things I want to say before we finish up. And of course, if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. One of the things that I'd like you to think about is the concept of perceptual positions. Now, this comes from neuro-linguistic programming, and basically it says this, that when we're in a conversation with someone, we can adopt three key positions. So in the bottom left-hand corner is the very basic position that most of us are in most of the time. Now, the first position is where you're looking at things through your own eyes. So you see things from your own perspective. And if you're in first position, you could be, for example, having an argument with someone where you're defending your particular view of the world. And of course, if they're in first position as well, which is most likely, then it's possible that you're going to be, raising your voice, finger pointing, very animated, because both of you are trying, like anything, to try to convince the other person of the virtue of your position. Now, this is the least productive of the three positions to be in. And as a leader, I think it's extremely important for you to not be in first position very often. There are times, of course, where it's appropriate to be in first position. But in a conversation, and in fact, any of these conversations that I've run through with you today, it's important to at least get into second position. So first position is where I suppose you could use the metaphor that you're in a forest and you've got your head buried up against the tree trunk, a large tree in a forest, and you've got your nose up against that tree. Now, because you're staring at the tree trunk, you're not conscious of the fact that you're in a forest. Your position, of course, is just to see the bark in front of you. And that's what first position is, the least effective of the three positions. Now, if we move into second position, this is where we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the other person. So this is at least trying to understand the other person's point of view. It doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with them, it just means to understand. And in order to understand, you've got to be curious enough to try to suspend your judgment and hear what the other person has to say. So what that means is that you need to ask them to explain their position, or how do they see things, or use open-ended questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. What you're attempting to do, of course, is to understand why they hold or adopt that point of view. Now, why is that important? Well, because obviously if you show some interest in their position, it's highly likely that they'll show an interest in your position as well. It's just an incredibly, it just happens that way. But the more you defend your position, which of course is first position, the more they're inclined to defend their position. In other words, the less effective you actually are. So what I suggest you do is to suspend and talk and just ask people why. Why do you have that point of view? Can you give me an example? Can you explain that a bit further to me? All of those things give the other person an opportunity to share with you how they view the world, which I think is extremely important. Now, that's a more constructive situation to be in, but it's not necessarily the ideal circumstance. So second position, first position is like staring at a tree trunk and having your nose up against the tree trunk. Second position is like stepping back from the tree, okay, and understanding that you're actually in a forest, and that in fact there are many, many trees in the forest. And if you look around, you can see all the different trees, which of course is being in second position. Now, the most ideal position is at the top there, which is third position. This is where not only do you have your own point of view, not only do you understand the other person's point of view, but third position means that you're in a position where you can kind of contextualize the conversation that you're having. You can see how it fits into the scheme of what you're doing at work. So that you understand the context, you understand the timing, you can work out whether it's going to fly or not. And so third position is where you can step back even further and be able to completely embrace the circumstances, the timing, and so forth. It is no doubt the harder of the three positions. But the analogy that I was using about being in a forest is a bit like you being in a helicopter and you're looking down at the forest and you're looking down at the forest and all you can see is just a sea of green. You can't actually see the individual trees. You know they're there, but all you can see is a sea of green, and you can understand the context of the forest. You understand where the forest is. You understand where the coastline is. You understand a lot of things about the forest. So being a leader, of course, you do at times think in third position, but I would suggest to you when you're having a conversation, it's important to try to adopt that third position. And if you can do that, you'll find that your conversations will be far more effective. So that really requires you to be thinking a little bit about being in that third position as much as you possibly can and not second. Now, the other thing I just want to finish up with before I give you homework is, and I've talked about this earlier, is questioning skills. Remember, leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. Probably your training, whatever that training might be, was around answering questions. As I said before, if you've got a trade or a university degree, it's probably likely that you learnt to answer questions. That's the whole purpose of doing the course. But when you move into a leadership role, your job is then to ask questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. These are all the key questions that you need to ask. So ask questions, draw people out, create a dialogue, have a conversation. All of those things become critically important in terms of having a conversation. Interestingly enough, first position, second position, and third position, the more likely you are to be in second and third position is the more likely you are to be asking a bunch of questions. So you're getting the other person to explain their position and all the while thinking very carefully about how it locks in and fits into what you're doing at work. So get good at asking questions, because if you get good at asking questions, you're likely to be a good conversationalist. That's the truth of it. Okay, so just summing up what we've been doing today, we've looked at the barriers to creating a conversation culture, and I shared with you 9 barriers. They're all very real. I have no doubt there are more, but at this stage, I just wanted to share with you 9 that are very familiar with me. So what you need to do, of course, is to remove some of those barriers. Some of them are physical barriers, some of them are psychological barriers, some of them are emotional barriers. Some of them, believe it or not, are technological barriers, but we need to remove them if we're really serious about having decent conversations. Then I shared with you the 5 conversations framework, which is a framework that you can use on a monthly basis to have 5 10-minute conversations once a month with each of your team members. And the third element of what I shared with you today was 5 more conversations that you can have with your team and colleagues. So you can probably imagine where I'm going with this. The homework is this. I'd like you to organise a regular catch-up with each of your direct reports, that is the people that are in your team. Now, you may well be doing this already, and I hope you are, and if you are doing this already, well done. That's a good starting point. But what I want you to do now is to improve the process somewhat by incorporating a more effective dialogue by using either the 5 conversations framework or the 5 additional conversations I shared with you today. I'd like you to meet with them fortnightly or monthly. It depends on how many reports you've got, and there's a whole bunch of things that are going to get in the way as to whether it's fortnightly or monthly. And I'd like you to stick at that schedule no matter what. So no cancellations, you stick to that. And if in fact you have to go away on a business trip or you can't deal with that right there and then, you reschedule those appointments and you make them 15 minutes and you make them fortnightly or monthly and you stick with it no matter what. I will guarantee to you that after about 3 or 4 months, you will find that your performance, team performance, will go up. Not only will it go up, it'll go up significantly. And this is literally as simple as that. It's also as difficult as that because obviously if it was that easy, of course, we'd all be doing it. In other words, there's all sorts of distractions that are likely to get in the way. There are things that you'll be asked to do, reports to write, things to deal with, but you've got to be ruthless with your time. You've got to set your standards and say that I'm going to do this no matter what. And if you do this, you'll be absolutely amazed at the difference it'll make in terms of productivity in your workplace. I can only suggest to you to try it, and I strongly recommend that you do that. So, folks, that brings us pretty much to the end. You've been very quiet today, but that's okay. I hope it's been useful for you, and I'd strongly recommend you start having these conversations this afternoon. So start straight away, and I'm sure you'll get great response from it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a fantastic week, and we'll catch up not this week on Friday, but the following week for unit number 4. So thank you, folks, and I wish you all the best. Thank you and goodbye.